Right now, the two pine trees were no taller than Locke. He and Gary made a point of removing the turf in one piece. Between the two of them, it took less time than Locke would have thought to dig a hole almost 2 feet deep. Gary wrapped the geode in a plastic bag and buried it, stomping the dirt down firmly to get as much of it as they could back in the hole. He carried the rest away into the bucket to dump somewhere. When they put the turf back, you could hardly tell the soil had been disturbed at all. Locke crept up to the door of his own house and peered through the screen. "What are you doing?" said Gary in a low voice. "Checking to see if the coast is clear," whispered Locke. "If Mom sees us bringing shovels into the house, she's gonna want to know why. Okay, she's in the kitchen now." Locke thought about tiptoeing upstairs, but decided at the last second that it would be less suspicious just to walk normally. Thankfully, both he and Gary managed to get the shovels up the stairs and into the bedroom closet without banging them against anything. "Wish we could put a real door on this thing," muttered Locke as they went through the portal again. "A couple of hinges, a bolt, some screws, wood screws, not the other kind, and you're there," said Gary. The rainbow had faded by the time they got back through the portal. Seeing the two mighty vine-clad trees that had been skinny little saplings when he last saw them, Locke couldn't help wondering just how far in the future they were. As they dug, they found the soil was nice and moist, but some tree roots seemed to have gotten in the way. Something like a skinny, grayish German shepherd, Gary said it was a coyote, stopped to watch them as they dug. At least this time they didn't have to bother with getting the turf out in one piece. And sure enough, Locke stuck in a shovel and something went thump under the dirt. They scraped some loose soil away, and it was the bag. Locke pulled out the geode and looked at it. It was just the same as it had been when he'd buried it. But then, it was a rock. It had already been thousands or maybe millions of years old when he'd gotten it, so this couldn't have been too big a deal. The years in between might have wiped out the human race, but they hadn't so much as scratched this thing. "So, this really is the future," said Gary. "Guess so." Gary gazed thoughtfully into the hole they'd dug. The coyote trotted off. "Well," said Gary, "the good news is we don't have to worry about our grandkids coming along and shooting us just to see what'll happen." I wonder. "What?" "I wonder what would happen if we went back and dug it up again." "What do you mean?" "I mean in our time, in the present." Something about this idea made Locke's stomach clench. "Well, if you dig it up again then, it won't be here now." "Exactly, so what'll happen to this one?" said Gary, pointing at the two halves of the stone in Locke's hands. "Come on, let's find out." "Are you sure this is a good idea?" said Locke as he followed Gary out through the portal. "What can go wrong?" said Gary. "If you think about it, this thing is already in 2 places at once. It's in your hands and it's in my backyard, so what difference will it make to dig it up?" "Well, if you're not gonna bury it again," Locke still didn't feel any too sure about this. "Look, whatever happens, you're still guaranteed to have one, right?" "I guess." It was weird. Where Troy had been a great one for breaking the rules, the bomb scare, sneaking a peek into the girls' cabins at night, stealing disciplinary forms from the principal's office for God only knows what reason. Up until now, Gary had come across as kind of a goody two-shoes, but what he was talking about doing now seemed to Locke to take rule-breaking to a level Troy could never have imagined. Burying something once and digging it up twice. It wasn't that you weren't supposed to do that, it was that you weren't supposed to be able to do that. And yet, now that the idea was out there, Locke had to admit he was kind of curious to see what would happen. "Hold on," said Gary as they re-entered his backyard. "I want to get my camera." "Why?" "Because if this thing," he pointed at the stone, "is going to dematerialize or something, I want it on video." Once Gary had gotten his camera out and pointed it at the geode, Locke started to dig. The more he dug, the more nervous he got, but somehow chickening out in front of Gary was even harder than chickening out in front of Troy. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" said Gary eagerly. "Like any minute now the sky's gonna open up and God's gonna stick his head out and yell, 'You kids stop playing with the fabric of space and time this instant.'" Locke laughed, although this wasn't far from what he'd been thinking. About this time, he found the plastic bag with the geode in it. He had to take a moment to gather his courage. "Well, here's hoping this doesn't destroy the universe," he finally said. He reached into the hole and pulled out the bag. "The other one's still here," said Gary. Locke took the geode out of the bag and set it aside. Then he started filling up the hole again. "It's still here," said Gary. Locke finished filling up the hole. He patted down the dirt with the blade of the shovel. "Still here," said Gary. I feel like we got away with something, said Locke, but I don't know what. There's got to be some kind of rule about this, said Gary. Like, once a physical object exists in this world, you can't just make it go away by changing its past. Or something.